If you're interviewing for high-paying roles, you'll definitely come across the "tell me about a time you failed" question. And 90% of people answer this question wrong. This either leads to a loss of trust, loss of seniority, reduced compensation, or getting rejected altogether. If you're new here, I'm Balaji. I've worked at and had offers from some of the world's top tech companies such as Microsoft, Meta, and XAI. And I've been on both sides of the interviewing table. And the interesting thing about this question is that most people don't know where exactly they go wrong. And in the age of AI, your answers to behavioral questions matter more than they've ever mattered before. So today I'll help you master this question and knock it out of the park. We'll cover 4 things. First, what this question is actually looking for. Second, common traps and mistakes to avoid. Third, we'll construct a formula for the top 1% answer. And fourth, I'll give you an example answer of my own. Let's get into it. So first, what is this question really looking for? They're looking primarily for 4 things. First, ownership and accountability. Second, a form of self-awareness. Third, humility and coachability, your ability to learn and keep growing. And fourth and finally, they're trying to get some signal on your overall maturity and seniority. They want to start by knowing whether you first accept responsibility for the failure. Do you genuinely take a step back and reflect on what went wrong? What could you have done better? This question also gives them an opportunity to see what level of maturity and seniority you're at, what level of ownership you've had. Are you owning small features or are you owning complex projects? So before we craft our top 1% answer, let's quickly cover 6 common traps and mistakes, and this will prime us to avoid these while crafting our answer. Number 1, and the most common mistake that people make, which is success masquerading as a failure. I can't tell you how many times I've seen people make this mistake. They'll come with some story like, oh, we wanted to create this $100 million product and we only created like an $80 million product and my life is so hard and I just overworked myself and this is a huge failure. Please don't do that. That is not what they're looking for, and interviewers see right through that. This will get you booted out of the door faster than you can think. Now, most people try to avoid this trap and end up overcompensating and making mistake number 2, which is picking a complete catastrophe as a failure. Please don't do that either. Hopefully that hasn't happened, but even if that has happened, between you and me, now may not be the time for that story. Now, the third mistake is that of deflecting blame or not taking ownership. If you have failed for something, if you've picked the story correctly, please take ownership of the failure. Yes, every failure can have 10, 15 reasons or 3 or 4 reasons or multiple people involved for why it failed, but do not deflect blame. Take the ownership of failure on yourself. The fourth mistake that people make in this answer is not fixing the failure. So the question says, tell me about a time you failed. They say, this is what happened, this is how I failed, and they just move on from that story. This answer needs to show signal that you worked on that failure and eventually succeeded or learned something from it. Mistake number 5 is having a poor story structure or no structure at all. Many candidates literally have no structure in this answer or are using a very basic structure like the STAR framework. That's right, we're going to be challenging the STAR framework today and we're going to be taking it one level up. And finally, mistake number 6, not refining your delivery. A lot of candidates feel like because they went through the story themselves, they don't really need to refine the delivery. But the problem is, your job is not just to communicate what happened, it is to make the other person understand the importance of every single thing that you went through. You're going to do a severe injustice to the quality of your story if you rely purely on long-term memory to craft this answer in real time. So let's incorporate all of these mistakes, make sure we avoid them, and craft our top 1% answer. Now, our formula for a top 1% answer has 3 parts to it, and it starts by picking the story. This story for the tell me about the time you failed question, it must be a genuine failure. Do not pick something that is a success masquerading as a failure, and at the same time, do not pick a catastrophe. This story picking is extremely important, and it is all about balance. This story should signal that you take accountability for your failure, and it shows how you have grown as a professional. It should also accurately reflect the right level of seniority for who you are right now or what kind of role you are shooting for. If you pick a story that's a few years old, Not only will the interviewer not be a fan of this, you'll actually be doing injustice to yourself because you'll be signaling a lower level of seniority because the work that you did a couple of years ago was probably more junior work. So if you pick a story that's super recent, it gives a more accurate signal on what kind of responsibilities you've been entrusted with, and that allows them to position you correctly within the company and potentially maximizes the offer that you can get. Because it's these hidden subtle details in all of these answers that tells them what level you are actually at, and even within a level, where inside that level you're at. So for example, if you're an L4, L5, a senior or principal, are you a fresh new senior or fresh new principal, or are you a seasoned senior or a seasoned principal waiting to go to the next level? It's these details that define all of these. So start by creating a story bank of what all has happened in the last year or so. And the interesting thing is that sometimes because we're going about our job in such a normal way, we often forget that certain instances might actually have a story in there, but we just forget that there's actually a story in there. So take some time to actually think about what all has happened in the last year, when there were disagreements, when you started working on a certain direction and then you changed your direction, because that also is a form of a failure. Now, once you've created a story bank, our next step in this formula is actually crafting the story. First, start off by writing your story in the H*L structure. This is an upgraded version of the STAR method, and it makes two key improvements. The most important thing in these stories is that for 90% of candidates, their story reads like a mystery novel. Meaning, for 80% of the story, we don't really know where this story is actually going and what the failure is really about. The fix to this is what I call the headline. The first sentence in our story needs to accurately represent what this failure is actually about. Think of it like an executive summary of a document. So rather than starting the story at the start of the story, start with an executive summary or a headline that accurately represents what this story is really about. Once the listener knows this detail, every single detail that you share about this story automatically starts to make more sense to them. A complete explainer on the H*L method is over here. I'll link it in the description as well. Now, that video is one of my earliest videos, so I wasn't quite as comfortable on YouTube or creating videos, so the quality is a little bit iffy, but in terms of the content, it is all there. If you can bear through the first minute or so, you'll definitely find the content that you're looking for. So once you kick off the story with the headline, you go through a regular STAR structure, and you finally wrap up with L as the learning. This is incredibly important, especially in the tell me about a time you failed questions, because you genuinely want to show what you have learned out of this story. So the protocol I recommend here is to write out your story in bullet points using the H*L structure. You don't need to write full sentences, although sometimes when you're trying to write bullet points, you'll get into thinking about the story and those bullet points might get converted into full sentences. That's okay. Don't worry about it. You can shorten it back to bullet points later. Now, a very important piece of this story writing procedure is what I call the stranger effect. When crafting this story, we want to maximize the number of times we look at our own story as a complete stranger. So once you've written down the bullet points, step away from that story and come back to it the next day or 6 hours later and repeat this process 6 to 8 times. It might take you 3 days or it might take you 6 days. But if you're trying to get the stranger effect twice in a day, that means you step out of the story, 6 hours later you look at it, you can get through 2 iterations in a single day, because every single time you look at that story as a stranger and you've lost the context you had while you were writing out that story, you'll perceive that story more like the listener will perceive it. And that will allow you to identify where the gaps are. Are there sections where I'm spending way too much time? Are there sections where the story made sense to me because I had context while writing it, but when I reread this, it's not making as much sense anymore? And overall, will I be able to deliver this story in the allotted 2-ish minutes, which is what I would recommend for this answer? Right now, the goal is not even to deliver this answer beautifully. The goal is just to have absolute certainty on what exactly we want to be saying and how much detail we will provide at each section of the answer. Once you complete this, finally, the last step is to refine your delivery. After you have certainty on this is the exact stuff I want to call out, you need to refine the delivery of your answer, make sure that the right level of detail is being shared, and that a listener can follow along with you correctly. Now, the hardest part about this section is that it is very difficult to judge your own homework correctly. You'll always feel like you're delivering the answer really well, but what you need is a stranger to actually detect whether you're providing the right depth of signal and if your story is flowing correctly, because all of these details are going to matter in what kind of offer you get and what kind of seniority you end up at. So if you're intentional about genuinely getting to the top 1% with this answer, you can find a link below to book some time with me where I can hear out your story, genuinely find every single gap that might be there, and elevate your answer to the top 1%. And finally, as an example, let me share with you a story that I call the geofencing fiasco. So this happened at OfferUp, which is a marketplace similar to Facebook Marketplace where people can buy and sell things. And I failed to help car dealers accurately understand which of their in-store customers, people who were in their store, came there because they saw their cars on our platform. So the situation was that at OfferUp, we had created a brand new vertical around cars, which is one of the most expensive things people buy. And our concept was that we'll keep car selling free for everyday people like you and me, which is households, but we will monetize car dealers. So my task was to figure out if there's a frictionless way that does not rely on human input for us to accurately get credit for how many people we send to the store. So the action I took was to create something called a geofence. Basically, you take a map, and where the exact store is, you put a pin on it, and 100 meters around that, you put some sort of a digital radius. And if a buyer were to go inside that radius, it would send us a trigger. And with that piece of information, we can accurately know that this buyer who saw this car on our platform went into this store. We can go back to the dealer with this information and say, hey, give us credit for bringing you this person and continue spending with us more because we're giving you value. And in our tests, it seemed to be working fine with some accuracy issues. However, despite our best efforts, this project ultimately failed. This failed for 3 key reasons. First, location permissions. See, for this feature to work, we needed the always allow location sharing permission from our users. We overestimated how many people would actually give us this permission, and to be fair, it is a little bit creepy, so we understand people not wanting to give us that permission. However, the actual number of people who gave us this permission was much lower than what we had anticipated. We were hoping maybe 20-30% would do it, but the final number came out to 1 or 2%. The second reason was the accuracy of the pin itself. So sometimes we would set up the pin exactly on the store, but it would set it 50 meters away or 100 meters away, and that creates a lot of problems, including failure mode number 3, the incorrect trigger. See, already if the pin is incorrectly set up, that has its own issues, but sometimes what we would see is that this trigger would either not fire or fire when it shouldn't have fired. So for example, sometimes people would be driving on the freeway next to the actual car dealership or going to the neighboring dealership, and it would mistakenly fire. This is a big no-no because in the advertising world, you can never take more credit than what you deserve. It's okay to take less credit or equal credit, but never over credit. That genuinely impacts trust. So finally, this unfortunately ended up failing, and as an alternate solution, we came up with a method of understanding what is happening in the text messaging, which is a little bit more use of large language models to understand the intent. So if somebody says, I'm coming to the store or something like that, we use those signals to accurately solve the same problem. I had 2 key learnings coming out of this. The first was the overall observation bias in our research. For example, a lot of people that we researched with, they were super familiar with the product and they were okay to trust us with the always allow permissions. And as test users ourselves, we were okay with giving ourselves always allow permissions, but we couldn't extrapolate that same justification to hundreds of thousands of users. The second learning was what I call failing gracefully. This is something I have my manager at the time to thank for. He set us up in such a way that we failed pretty gracefully in about 6 weeks or so. If it weren't for his guidance, I would have structured the project differently, and I think we would have failed 3-4 months later with a much higher investment amount. This is a learning I didn't have as a result of the failure, but throughout the process, his guidance helped me in restructuring the project in such a way that we're failing as fast as possible and getting signal as quickly as possible. So that is my answer to this question. In this answer, I've used 2 specific techniques. The first is the 8-spiral method, and the second is what is called the pyramid principle of communication. Links to both of those videos are in the description below. Now remember, how you communicate in this answer has these subtle signals that determine what maturity they see you at, what level of ownership they see you at, and what level of seniority that they're likely going to give you in your offer, including what compensation package you're going to receive. So it's very important to get this answer absolutely nailed down. So take all of this content, watch the other videos, prepare your answer, and then if you really want to elevate your answer to the top 1%, feel free to book some time with me. We'll go through your answer, identify any potential gaps, and then see how we can take this to the absolute top 1% with no information shared unintentionally. I hope this video helped, and see you on the next one.